Hi everyone and welcome to Azure Advent Calendar. Our topic for today is Azure Automation. My name is Tidjani Belmansour. I'm a cloud solution architect working with Azure since 2009 and I'm an Azure MVP. But most importantly, I will be your host in today's episode of Azure Advent Calendar. What is Azure Automation? Azure Automations allows you to automate your Azure management tasks, such as configuring and updating servers, and automating processes, such as deployments, monitoring, optimization, and so on. For that matter, you will create runbooks, mainly scripts that will achieve what you are trying to do. Runbooks can be written either in PowerShell or Python. Usually, you'll run a runbook based on a schedule, but you can also trigger it from an Azure alert, for example. A runbook might also communicate with external systems via the use of modules. Azure takes care of the execution of the runbook by assigning it to a worker. Thus, when executing a runbook, you will see its execution state move from queued to starting, then running, all the way up to completed or stopped. What is Azure Automation used for? Basically, every management task you can think of. Here are some examples. Starting, stopping a VM during off hours in order to save costs. Configuring a VM with a desired state configuration or DSC. Backing up a database based on a schedule. Deploying an ARM template. Resizing resources based on alert or at specific times, also in order to save costs. And even cleaning up resources that are no more required. What will we be building? We all know that Azure resources usually cost money. When you are using these resources, this is fine because you have value out of that money you are spending. But how frustrating is it to discover that you forgot some resources that you no longer needed and that you were charged for? You might think that it is silly to forget resources that you don't need, but there are some situations where it will likely happen. For example, some of my customers dedicate a resource group or even an entire subscription for testing their ARM template and experimenting new approaches and strategies. These situations may quite easily lead to resources being forgotten there and not being used but being charged for. To avoid these situations, I've created an Azure Automation Run Book that periodically run, actually every night, and delete every resources in a specific resource group or subscription. For the purposes of the demonstration, we'll focus on one resource group. You may easily guess that deleting every resources in a subscription might be achieved by listing all the resource groups in the subscription and then by applying the runbook we'll be creating together. If you wish, you can push the concept of this runbook further. For example, you can modify it so it takes into account some specific tags on resources. What would these tags be all about? Well, you can set a delete by never tag on a resource that you want to keep in the targeted resource group, or set a delete by some date like 25 December 2020 to let the runbook know when to delete that resource. In this case, we'll delete it next year. So let's start by creating our Azure Automation account. Here we are in the Azure portal, so let's click on Create a Resource and look for Automation. Let's click on Create. We'll give it the name of Advent Calendar Automation. We'll select our subscription. We'll say that we want to create it in a new resource group. Let's say Auto RG, for example. We'll leave the create Azure Run As account to yes. More on that later. And hit create. It will take a few time to create our automation account, so let's speed things up. Setting the identity under which your automation account and runbooks will execute. You need to ensure that this identity has a required permission in order to perform the operation you're asking it to do. Remember that create Azure Run As account switch we saw when creating the automation account? Well, what it does is that it creates an application with a service principal and a certificate in the Azure AD tenant. This account will then be used to authenticate to Azure in order to execute the runbook. Note that this account will be granted by default the contributor role on the subscription, so be very careful with what you do with it. And remember that you need to be the owner of the subscription and administrator of the Azure AD tenant. Otherwise, the switch will be set to no and grayed out. Once this is set up, you can use these few lines of PowerShell in order to log in to Azure. So as you can see, we are using that account, the Azure Run As connection, and use it to authenticate to Azure. Now that our automation account is created, let's create a runbook. Going back to the Azure portal, and going to our automation account, we can go to Runbooks and create a new runbook. We'll give it a name of delete my resources and select the PowerShell type of runbooks. We can provide also a description saying that we will remove unused resources periodically and hit create. Importing a module. When working with PowerShell, we might need external modules, either modules we created on our own or modules from the PowerShell gallery. So let's see how we can import modules. For a module, if we go to the modules section here, we can first see all of the modules that are already imported along with their version number. If we want to import a module of our own, we can click on add a module and load it here as a zip file. If we want to get a module from the gallery, we can go to the module gallery, select a module and click on the import button. So for example, we import the PS Windows Update module. So we click OK. It may take some time. In this case it was very fast. And let's go back to the modules and look for PS Windows Update. Testing the runbook and viewing its outputs. So now that our runbook is created, let's do some code. We'll just copy and paste the previous code sample we saw earlier that helped us log in into Azure. And once our script is logged into Azure, let's simply list our resource groups that are part of our subscription. So for that matter, we simply type get Azure RM resource group. And in order to test our script, our runbook, let's click on the test pane. Since our runbook needs no input parameters, so we can simply click start and wait for it to execute. We can see the states moving from queued to running, and after some time it will likely be finished or completed. So here is it, and here are all the resource groups that are part of our subscription. If we want our runbook to have input parameters, we can simply create parameters just as we would have done in any PowerShell script. So here, for example, we have two parameters. The first one is of type string and is optional, and the second one is of type strings too, but is mandatory, so it's required. Let's click on the test pane, and now, as you may see, we have two text boxes where we can set our values for our parameters. One thing to mention is that the first one, as it is optional, is not required, but the second one, you can see a little star mentioning that it is required. So if I start or try to start my script, it will fail because I didn't provide any value. So let's say OK and start it, and now my script will run, and we got our output just as before. Publishing the runbook. Now that our runbook is ready to be used, it has to be published first. So for that matter, we can simply click on the Publish button and confirm. Now our runbook is published. Please note that we have a Revert to Published button here, and what this button will do is that it will revert our runbook to its last published version. In other words, if we made modifications to our runbook that we are not fully satisfied with, we can undo this and revert to the last published version of the runbook. Defining a schedule for the runbook. Once our runbook is developed, tested, and published, we can define a schedule for it to run. So, going back to our runbook, we click on Schedules, and here we can see the Add a Schedule button enabled. Please note that until your runbook is published, this button will be grayed out. So let's click on it. Let's select a new schedule. We'll create it. We'll name it Run Every Night. And we'll say run at 1 a.m. starting today and never expiring. We'll say that we want to run it once a day and hit create. Now since our runbook has input parameters, we have to provide values for them. Let's say Azure Advent Calendar and hit OK. Now we can hit OK again, and we have a schedule for our runbook. Viewing jobs history. A job means a runbook's execution. Once our runbook runs for a couple of times, we can see the history of its executions. Here in the overview of the runbook, we can see the list of recent executions or jobs, but if we want a detailed list, we can simply click here on the jobs entry. Here we can see that we had 4 executions, 3 of which were completed successfully and 1 that failed. If we click on one entry, we can see the input parameters and their values during the execution. We can see the output to the console. We can see the list of errors along with the details of that error, the warnings, and the exceptions. We can also click on all logs and see everything in one place. Importing and exporting runbooks. Runbooks can be either imported from an existing PowerShell script or Python, or even exported if you have created them in the Azure portal. So let's see together how we can do this. So first, let's import an existing runbook. So here on the Azure Automation account, we click on Runbooks, and we click on the Import a Runbook button. We'll select a file. Here, luckily, I have one on my desktop. And by default, it will take the same name as the PowerShell file, but you can of course change it. Here, the runbook type is of type PowerShell, and we can provide a description. Let's say imported runbook, and hit create. Importing our new runbook will take a few time. Here is it, and we simply have our runbook with one line of code. We can test it, of course. So here is it, very simple, right? So now let's go back and export an existing runbook. So going back to our runbooks, we'll take our previous runbook and click on export. And by simply clicking on this button, the runbook will be downloaded in our download folder. Our runbook in action. Now that we have seen the basics of Azure Automation Runbooks, let's take a closer look at our use case. Remember, we wanted to create a runbook that deletes every resource in a given resource group. So here is the code. As you may see, our runbook takes 2 parameters. So the resource group name, for which we want to delete the resources, and the subscription ID in which that resource group lives. So first, we start by logging into Azure. Then we get a list, we get our resource group, and then we start deleting the resources. For that matter, we get every resource in that resource group, and then we do a for each loop for every resource in that list. We check if that resource is either a key vault or an automation account or a runbook. If it is, we don't delete this resource because obviously we don't want to neither lose our secrets nor we want to lose our runbooks. And if it's not, we perform a remove on that resource. One thing to notice here is that our runbook is of type PowerShell workflow, which is very similar to PowerShell Runbooks, with the addition that it allows us to perform a parallel task perform parallel tasks. So here we want to perform a parallel for each. Before we execute our runbooks, ahead of time, I've created a resource group with several resources in it. And for that matter, I created a PowerShell runbook. So here we have some resources. And here we can see the runbook that creates the infrastructure. So similar as before, we log into Azure, we define some variables, and we start creating resources. So here we are creating the resource group. If it doesn't exist, we create a key vault in that resource group. If it doesn't exist, a storage account, and a web app. Now let's run our PowerShell runbook to delete those resources. So we go back to our runbook and run it. It will ask us for the resource group name, resources to delete, as well as the subscription ID. Now our runbook has started. It will take some time to execute. So we'll speed things up. Now that our script has run and everything has been deleted, let's go back to our resource group. And here we can see that only the key vault remains. So as we mentioned, we don't want to remove either resources of type key vault or automation account or runbooks. So here we still have our key vault. And that's it for the demo. Best practices in creating Azure Automation accounts. These best practices are based on my own experience. First of all, avoid one account per runbook. In most cases, this will be overkill. An automation account can have multiple runbooks, and each runbook can have its own schedule. An identity is associated with an account, not a runbook. Keep that in mind. So this will be a good start to know whether or not you need to create a new automation account. Another good reason is to look at the IAM roles. You can ask yourselves, who can have access to that automation account? Remember that you can't set permissions per runbook, but rather per account. So this will be another good reason to create a new automation account or not. Also make sure that the identity of the automation account has proper privileges. As we mentioned above, by default, that identity has the contributor role on the entire subscription. You might want to remove that permission and give it proper permissions on proper resource groups or even on resources. Well, this is all for today, but there is so much more goodness provided by Azure Automation. In this episode of the Azure Advanced Calendar, we learned what Azure Automation is all about, what use cases it targets. We took a real-world scenario and implemented it, from creating the automation account, the runbook, and the schedule, all the way to testing and publishing that runbook. Finally, I gave you some advices on how to effectively design your automation accounts, based on my own experience. Thank you all for watching. I hope that now you see some scenarios where you can apply Azure Automation too. Have a great vacation time and Merry Christmas!